Hey kids, this is Ivan. How you doing? Well, I'm really kind of surprised how many people watched that video I posted in response to Rob H. about my gaming evolution and changing perspectives, especially because it was ridiculously long. And because at the end of the day, I really didn't answer all of his question. But, it maybe one of the things I want to talk about, which I kind of allude to at the end of the video, and said, I didn't talk about this at all, was my continued changing perspectives on things like game complexity, rules light versus rules heavy and all that sort of thing. Because Rob actually mentions that, in part of what has had him gravitate now towards the OSR is things like, rulings, in the absence of or over rules, roar as opposed to raw. He didn't say that, but those are the terms. This video really doesn't have a heck of a lot to do with that, but those are the terms. I'll talk about it a little bit. But it got me thinking about experiences that I've had recently with the bunch of games that I've been playing and learning over the past couple of years, and also of a conversation that we had in a Facebook group, the Techniques Consortium, that started, if Facebook can be believed, back in October 2017. And I would love to take credit for the original idea, but I can't. Because Anthony Runeslinger actually posted this video back then talking about different spectra or domains of things that we call things like light and heavy and easy, hard, simple, complex, which I'll get to in a second. And that sparked a discussion which continued to at least about a year ago, about February, because I'm looking at some of the posts. I think I had one from February 7th, 2018, where we were talking about this quite a bit. I don't know that I ever shared some of these things here, but, well, if I did, well, I'm going to share it again, because I have some more experience with actually coming up head-to-head with games and finding my reactions to them. And of course, if you go way back in my channel, you'll find me back when I was much nastier, being a big champion of rules light and rulings over rules and screw your complex rule sets and all this other kind of stuff. And a lot of my experience then was essentially going from really what I thought was simple, basic D&D to advanced D&D, which was hideously complex, to Pathfinder, and finding that just to be, horrifically complex, not my cup of tea, something that I struggled with, and then going back to the OSR, which, some of the people that had posted in responses, they talk about their kind of evolution or full circle or what have you, but of course, there's a lot of other games out there. There's, there's a lot of stuff. That's just kind of a circle within one form of game. But I digress. So, anyhow, let me get to the meat of this sort of thing. The three domains that Anthony came up with, which I think really, really kind of nail it, and I'll add a couple other ones which are kind of tangential that I talked about years ago, or a year ago, was the idea that you can talk about games being light versus heavy. And this is, so to define this, we'll call this the number of operations required for a result. How many times do you have to roll dice? How many things do you have to do? How many charts do you have to consult to finally get your result? Is it going to be a simple, roll, okay, this happened, roll a d6, now we know what happened? Or do we have to roll this and then roll another chart and another chart? Or do we need to consult this procedure and that procedure? Do we need to make an opposed roll like in Ubiquity? Or is it going to be more like a Shadowrun thing where you roll to hit and roll to defend and roll to damage, do damage and roll to, escape damage and all that sort of stuff? How many operations do you need to do? So that's kind of the light and heavy domain. All right, so let's try to remember that, because I'm not going to annotate this video. I don't have time. The next domain would be easy versus hard. And this is more of a personal assessment. The first one is just objective. It is what it is. You can sit there and count them. Your personal assessment of difficulty applying the system and of filling in the gaps. You could find a particular system which has lots of steps, very easy to do. I got into the, to the point where something like Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, because I was a young teenager and had nothing else to do, so I read the book a lot. Very easy to do, but somebody else, their personal assessment could be, this is very hard, because are you kidding me, dude? This stuff is all over the place. And conversely, I could run into another game, which I'll talk about, I'll skip ahead a little bit, but talk about, say, The Veil, where there wasn't a lot of operations I had to do. It was light, but I found it was much harder to apply the system, and partly because of having to fill in the gaps and how I had to fill in the gaps. Okay? So like, you know, your personal assessment can vary, and it's not necessarily connected to the light and heavy spectrum. So that's easy and hard. And then finally, simple versus complex. This is your personal assessment of the difficulty of learning the system, the setting, etc. You know, how much effort is it taking you to finally figure out, oh, I've learned this now. And you know, it varies from game to game. For me, something like, let's say, Uncharted Worlds. It was very easy to sit down, read that game, and understand it. And understand this limited setting that it had. But you know, understanding the procedures to make your setting. I found that my personal assessment is extraordinarily simple. When I sat down to read The Veil, another PBTA game, I found that one particularly complex to learn the entire system because there were so many other peripheral moving parts, which we'll get to that in another domain, one of mine. So two games are, on surface should be fairly simple, or fairly similar rather, but my ability to learn those was different. I made a video a long time ago talking about, you know, learning settings is hard, and you know, complaining a little bit about Desolation. I love Desolation, but there's a lot of different names to remember and all kinds of stuff, and the setting is very involved and very rich. And so my personal assessment at that time was that it was complex to learn the setting. It still is. It's just it takes some time and effort. There's big giant games I've gotten on my shelf there. I think Raiders of Real, yeah. You can kind of see it peeking around right over there. You know, there's a lot of stuff with that, with Leagues of Adventure, Leagues of Cthulhu. I'm trying to think of what else. Maybe Hollow Earth Expedition to a lesser extent. There's a lot of stuff that I don't know about those time periods, about history. So learning the setting in an accurate manner takes more time. It's more complex. Somebody else may find that stuff incredibly simple. Maybe they're just a history buff and they know that stuff already, or it's so fascinating, so engaging, which, another domain, I'm skipping ahead. But anyhow, so various games that I've run into have been had different levels of, you know, either being simple or complex for me to learn the game, the procedures, the system, whatever. So those are three different domains that, you know, they don't necessarily all have to line up for one person. So I realize it's getting long already, but you know, hopefully there's going to be a point, or more of my personal experience with games. I thought about positing a fourth domain, which is kind of more of like a bias and preference thing, and this I would call engaging and tedious. And when you finally put together those other three domains, you figure, okay, well, is this, you know, how many operations are there? Is it light or is it heavy? Is it simple or complex? You know, when I'm actually applying the system, is it easy for me to do? You know, simple. See, it's got to be careful with the words you use. Is it simple for me to do, or is it complex? Like, oh man, I got to remember to do this, do that. You know, was it easy or hard? See, I'm using the wrong words. Is it easy for me to do it, or is it hard for me to do it? And then, was it simple for me to learn this, or complex for me to learn this? You know, maybe sometimes I'm playing the game and I have to stop and say, oh wait, I've got to look up this rule because I forget. You know, and so I have to go back and, you know, look and whatever. So, at the end of the day, am I finding this engaging or tedious? And this is very much a bias and preference thing. You know, years ago, my very first YouTube video was a little bit about engaging versus tedious. I didn't realize it at the time, but in my rebuttal video to Tetsubo 57, which was just, man, I can't believe people still watch that video. I had a point, it was buried somewhere. But the idea is, like, we were talking about essentially the same game. You know, we're talking about Pathfinder versus, you know, basic D&D or something like that. It's in that same family of games. But the idea that it was kind of a rules versus ruling sort of thing. And at the end of the day, he found it tedious to stop his game to make something up. Whereas I found it tedious to stop my game to look up a rule. It didn't find, but each one of us found the other way engaging. He found all those rules and how all those moving parts very engaging. I found them tedious. This was bias and preference. But it was based upon, you know, our assessment. Is this easy or hard to do? Yeah. So, there was one other domain I thought of, and that was elegant versus eccentric. And once again, this is very much a, you know, tangential bias and preference sort of thing. But looking at a system, very often I've talked in the past about finding systems seductively elegant. I find the PBTA mechanic seductively elegant. I find the Fate mechanic seductively elegant. You roll these dice, here's what happens. To be honest with you, I find the Star Wars narrative dice system, core mechanics, seductively elegant. You roll these dice, you look at the symbols, okay, these are the kind of results you're going to have. Stuff like that I find really neat. Versus eccentric, where there's all kinds of wonky operations going on. I found, for the most part, something like Uncharted Worlds to be seductively elegant, to be an elegant system. Not seductively elegant, just elegant, because you use the basic role for PBTA. There's not a lot of lists of what happens, but it's simply, more like that three-tier system. Okay, you had a strong hit, you got what you wanted. You had the weak hit, where there's going to be what you got what you wanted with a complication, or maybe you didn't get quite what you wanted, but you got a complication, thrown in there, and you just fail. As opposed to the Veil, which had a lot of other moving parts, a lot of other things you had to consider, a lot more lists that were related to the system, but then other currencies depending on what playbooks you were using, and moving, having to remember to use a tracker for how many times have you used a specific emotion before you become, I forget what the word was, but you become saturated with it, and then you have to do something to alleviate that, all that sort of stuff. I found that a more eccentric system. And that really has nothing to do with whether you like it or not, because some people really dig eccentric systems. I've had arguments or discussions with good friends of mine, where some of them like a unified mechanic because this is very elegant, and we're talking about some OSR games, and said, well, I'd change the saving throws to this to make it all unified. And I kind of like, in those games, the eccentricity of using all these different dice and all these different resolution mechanics for all this kind of stuff. So that really has nothing to do with whether you finally like it. It's just a personal assessment of that game and whether you decide this is fun or not. I should say that CGA actually added a great thing to the simple and complex domain, which was the idea of division between the rules and the library. The core rules, how do you actually play this game, versus the library being, all you think of like the spell lists or the splat books or all the various options, that sort of thing. And because sometimes you look at the totality of something. If I look at all of the charts and tables and everything in for weapons and blah 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 in something like Raiders of Grail, well, there's a big library associated with that book. The core rules of the D100, Open Quest, whatever you want to call it, Rune Quest, BRP, they're easier. They're simpler to learn than all that other stuff. That can make it very daunting. And a lot of other games, even like looking at some Ubiquity games, then you get to the equipment lists and all this other stuff, and like, oh man, there's so much stuff here. Anyhow, I blathered on and on. I really haven't talked about my experience with games recently, so let's talk about this a little bit to kind of wrap it up. Clearly, in something like the old games I've played, I find them to be pretty easy to run. I found them simple to learn. And of course they have to be simple to learn now because I have the curse of knowledge. I know how games like that work. If somebody puts in a different twist, it's like, oh, they're doing it this way now? Oh, that's kind of interesting. Okay. But it's easy. I know where they're going with that. And for the most part, those games are relatively light. There's very few operations required to actually produce a result. So some of the other games I've played it's been interesting and eye-opening to see what my reactions have been and what the actual experience has been like. In Star Trek Adventures, we all agreed that it was very complex to learn the game, and it had nothing to do with the game itself. It had to do with the fact that the book was laid out terribly. And there, information was all over the place, and so it was complex to learn. I found for myself, it was a little hard to apply the system, but over time, I got better at it. But I didn't get over the complexity of learning all of it. I did not learn all of it yet. Is the bottom line, and part of it was just because I found it at some point it got so frustrating for me to try to learn it that I was giving up and saying, oh, screw this, let's just play this session and get through it, and we'll do some role playing and we'll get on to the other side, because I just want to have this experience as my character. I want to be in the Star Trek world. I didn't talk about that at all in the first video. That was one of my holy grails, but that has nothing to do with this video at all. In something like, and also in terms of like how difficult it was, or how easy or hard it was to apply the system for me in terms of like choosing things for my character to do, as far as inspiration and spending the game currency, I still found that a little bit daunting. Something like Ubiquity, I was able to wrap my head around it pretty fast. It was pretty simple to learn once I got over like a bit of a learning curve. Applying the system itself and filling in the gaps when I need to, or what have you. I found the game so intuitive. Things like Hollow Earth Expedition, All for One, Regime Diabolique, Leagues of Cthulhu, Desolation. My personal assessment was that was easy to do, because it was this nice mix of, okay, here's this unified mechanic, you know what to do here, and I hate to say, like an old school sensibility when I'm not really sure what to do. I know how this mechanic works. I can add a few more dice or subtract a few more dice from the roll. I think I'm going to model what we're trying to go after here. In terms of number of operations required for a result, like hardly any. You roll these dice, boom, you have a success or a failure, or degrees of success or failure. Move on. Let's see what else. My Powered by the Apocalypse adventures so far. Uncharted Worlds, which I still would love to play again. I found that it was very light, and very few operations required for a result for the most part. Mostly, it was easy to apply. In the combat system, there's an alternate combat system, the one where you simply roll dice and you find out which kind of result you had, and then you're supposed to narrate everything that happened. That was a little harder to narrate, because the result was already kind of on the table. But for the most part, that game was really easy, at least in my estimation, to apply the system. And of course, it was very simple to learn. I found it elegant. The Veil, we really bumped heads against that game. I did. I'll speak for myself, but there was a lot. The way it was written, a lot of times it was very difficult to figure out what was going on or what you're supposed to be doing. So I found it a complex learn. I found it applying the system could be relatively hard, because as Eloy kind of joked, when you're playing PBTA, sometimes you're making crap up. But I sometimes what happened was, I'm used to making crap up, but sometimes the lists or what have you that it gave you were a little bit tougher to figure. Well, how do I make this make sense based on what it's telling me is happening here? How do I make this make sense in the fiction? And we definitely had some hurdles with that. We had some hurdles with how do we approach this as a game master? And I think finally Anthony had this sort of epiphany that in PBTA you need to be almost like gravity, this force pulling things down this direction. It's a different discussion. But I found it harder to apply the system. Number of operations required for a result, for the most part, very light. Roll the dice, here you go. Every once in a while there was little tangential things, but they weren't necessarily for that result. They were for other results that were supposed to be happening elsewhere. I didn't find the system elegant. I found it a little more eccentric at the end of the day. And I found, as a result, it a little bit more tedious to mechanically interface with the Veil, despite the fact that it's this really light system. So, that's just my own experience. In something like D100, our Mythos Mithras game, and our Delta Green game, which is going a little slower right now. I'm trying to kickstart that again. Actually, learning the system was a little complex at first, but over time it's become a little easier. And a lot of it has to do with the library. If you get rid of the library, learning how the D100 system works is pretty simple. Once you are able to wrap your head around some of that stuff. Character creation can be a bit daunting at first until you get over the idea of what you're doing there. I found it pretty easy to actually apply the system, because it gives you some pretty good direction as far as that's concerned. It's a little slower for me to actually finally grok the fullness of it, because we're playing in both cases by play-by-post, play by email. In some cases, the game master is handling some of the operations for us. So I'm a person that learns by doing, so there's parts of that I haven't quite caught up with. So I'm anxious to play that in person with some people and roll some dice and all that sort of thing. Number of operations, very little. You rolled percentile dice. There you go. This is what you have. So I found that, and this is bias and preference land. I found it to be much, very elegant and fairly engaging. Star Wars. Here's an interesting game. It's something that Robert, the narrator, said, hey, you want to see what I found, narrative dice system complex or easy or rules light or rules medium or rules heavy, as he says it. That's an interesting animal. The actual dice mechanic, because I've had a lot of conflicting reactions as we're playing the game. The dice mechanic, really elegant, really light. Boom, you roll the dice, here you go. That's not a lot of operations. Then there's the charts and the tables you have to look up on sometimes for combat and for critical hits and what have you. And these are things that I just, probably need to print out and have available to me rather than flipping back and forth through a book, or get a screen or whatever it is. There's at that level and some of the examples they give you for like what a threat would mean or despair would mean in various skill roles, that sort of thing. That's where it becomes a little bit more heavier in terms of number of operations. And those operations are simply lookup operations, or that kind of drifts over into the simpler complex. How difficult? What is my personal assessment of the difficulty of learning that system? Because there's a lot more moving parts, but stuff to consider. When you get into something like Starship Combat, then that becomes a little bit more complex. So that's a system that's still like, I don't know all the particulars, all the nuances of it. Sometimes in the middle of play, some of the other players know it better than I do. They definitely do. And I'm like looking around like, I'm not really sure what's going on here, which is hysterical because my character is, 1v4N is a pilot. That's his big skill. So we're engaging the most complex part of the game all the time, as opposed to like working our way up through baby steps, which is kind of comical, but that's where we are. Applying the system in that one, where is it on the easy hard spectrum? For me, it's somewhere in the middle. The actual, rolling of the dice, figure out, okay, here's what these symbols mean. Pretty easy. Figuring out, and I've talked about this before, but figuring out, okay, what am I allowed to, or where, how big is this room? What shape is this room when I narrate what these results are? Making stuff up in that context is still a little difficult for me. It depends. It depends on the actual role. But we've had discussions about this. When there's not a heck of a lot of guidance, okay, well, you've got 3 advantages versus 1 advantage here in this skill roll, or just bizarre situations happen. What are we going to do to differentiate those? So that's something that's, I'm sure will come more over time. The actual application of the system when now we're in a Starship Combat sort of thing, even if it's with a giant frog spider hybrid, which that's a great scene. Where we fire the harpoons at this thing and we roll a despair and it plummets down the cliff and we plummet down with it, which is one of those things when I'm doing this, I want to roll despair, and I did, and I was like, this is great, this is so Star Wars, and we're plummeting towards perhaps our certain death, but it's Star Wars, it's pulp heroics, we don't die, it's just a very unfortunate scene, very Han Solo. But I digress. The actual, my personal assessment of applying all those is still that it's a little hard. But that, is more in terms of like how much have I actually learned the game? How many times have I really done it? Once again, this is one of those things where it's the hazards of playing every week or every other week with a group, where you just don't do it enough to actually really completely wrap your head around it. So it's the learning by doing sort of thing. I do find, I've noticed that depending on where we are in that game, what kind of stuff we're doing, how much rules lookup we're involved in, that it can be, either engaging or somewhat tedious. But I realize some of that tedium is simply that I haven't gotten to the point where I understand everything that's involved there. So I'm trying to think if there's any other games. Man, this is a really long video. But I've had these experiences back and forth with various games. I realize still that my bias and preference tends to be towards games that are a little bit light in terms of how many operations do you really require to finally get to an end result. The more steps are involved, the more lookups, the more, what have you. I'm wrapping my head around doing more of that sort of stuff. I'm not entirely against it, although I know there's some hard limits for me. Some of my friends have decided to play some BattleTech Mech Warriors, play by post sort of thing, and I'm like, have a good time, guys. Just not. As for right now, I'm not interested in doing some kind of game like that. Maybe in the future. In terms of system application, that can be very different for me depending on the game. Like I've talked about, what are the guidelines for actually making the stuff up? So applying the system, even if it does have a small number of operations, what kind of guidance is around it? Is it well written? Is it poorly written? Do we really understand what we're trying to accomplish with a genre? that sort of stuff. So that can vary from game to game with me. And definitely, you know, my a stumbling block of mine has continued to be, you know, the difficulty in learning a particular system or setting or what have you. And it's a matter of, oh man, I've really been doing this for a long time. My alarm went off, telling me I probably should stop soon. But the idea that sometimes it takes a good amount of time, of which I don't have a heck of a lot, and I definitely have some concentration issues, which I've talked about in the past, where it's more of this effort. Okay, I've got to sit down and kind of ramp myself up to the point where it becomes engaging. And certain parts of games become very engaging to me, and other parts can, you know, border upon or become rather tedious, where it's just a long list, the library, if you will, that Antoine talks about, the CGA, complex games apologists, where at some point, you know, sometimes the library is simply just something out there in the, you know, you can look this up when you actually run the game or you know, play in the game. But sometimes that library, these things, these components are important to know, because in the moment, you know, my personal bias and preference, like I said years ago, is not to have to stop to look something up. You know, I like to at least know or have a good idea of these sorts of things. So it requires a lot more time actually learning the system, learning the setting, learning all these little pieces. Not that I have to learn everything, but I've noticed that there are times with games that I really like. I really like Star Wars and the narrative dice system, but there are moments where it's like, oh man, this chapter goes on forever, and there's all these tables and what have you. So it's an interesting look at like my approach to, you know, rules complexity, or like my reactions to it. At the end of the day, you know, we're all looking for that spot where we're engaged, where the game is doing something for us. You know, my personal sweet spot, I've discovered, is for the most part, you know, being able to step into the shoes of a character and to become them and make decisions as if I was them. And there's a certain point where, like, if I have to engage a lot of operations, then that becomes less fun. However, yeah, it depends on what we're going for. Sometimes I have to engage and think about quite a bit of stuff in ubiquity during a swashbuckling moment. We have to consider everything that's going on, and in the fiction too. But we have to sit there and figure, okay, which skill are we going to use here? So we do stop. We do talk about stuff here, but that's all rather engaging. You know, context is everything. So I'm not sure if this video made any sense. Hopefully you got something out of it. I mean, I find those domains of the light, heavy, number of operations required for results, easy, hard, your personal assessment of difficulty of applying the system and filling in the gaps, and simple, complex, your personal assessment of the difficulty of learning the system and the setting. I find those three domains really helpful in figuring stuff out, or at least putting things into context for me. You know, then there's little tangential things I talked about, whether it's, you know, engaging or tedious, or whether it's elegant or eccentric. Those are just, you know, sometimes for me little other ways to look at stuff. Why am I reacting a certain way to this, or, you know, or reacting badly to it, or really liking it. So anyhow, I think it's something that still fascinates me. I'm still, at the end of the day, somebody that really enjoys systems, looking at how rule sets work, all that sort of thing. But sometimes, as much as I enjoy all that, you know, when it actually comes time to play the game, you know, I get surprised. You know, what gets in the way, what doesn't get in the way, what do I find engaging, what don't I find engaging, and it can vary. Two games that look very similar on the surface can produce very different results. You know, in my head, like emotionally, it's like whether I'm like, yeah, this is great, or like, oh man, this is not doing it for me, and I don't have a poker face, so sometimes you can tell. Anyhow, if you've hung in this long, thanks a lot for watching, and I'll talk to you later.